If you were lucky enough, after grinding your youth away, throwing socializing down the toilet, and finishing your grade school years without a shower, you could have been a part of an Overwatch League team where you could fulfill the Crusher 99 dream. But in the case of our topic today, that being Striker, his career did not go as one would expect. Having a better career than most could ever hope for, sure, but also one that is so absurd to the point it genuinely sounds made up, which we are going to fully unfold right now. Striker is old, starting his professional grind back in 2017 on a team called Rock's Orcas, sharing it with 9K, Geggery, Krong, and Aid, who would all have varying success in Overwatch League later down the road. You would think this team is good, but it wasn't. It was kind of bad actually, not winning anything at all, not coming close to be honest. Out of these 5, only 2 of them went into Overwatch League in 2018. Geggery, who went to the Shanghai Dragons partway into the year, and Striker, who joined the Boston Uprising. Coming into contact with the man who then changed his life forever, Crusty, these two became inseparable, as you'll see later on. I'm not sure if Striker did something behind the scenes to make this bond build. Possibly it was due to his mechanical prowess. Striker was immediately a great talent at this level of play, bringing the whole just because a team sucks doesn't mean the player does scenario into reality. With how bad that Rock's Orcas team was, I don't think a soul would have any expectations for him, but thankfully he proved himself, playing a bit of hitscan, which he's not really known for in later years. It was serviceable here. Striker was not Carpe, he was just a solid guy, until you put him on Tracer. Striker and Tracer just clicked instantly, genuinely being one of the best tracers in the world during 2018. He was always able to make clutch plays or generally had better mechanical skill than anyone else around him. It was to the point Striker was just playing Stardew Valley instead, farming to levels way ahead of this time period, which is crazy because the masses didn't even know who Striker was. Players like Prophet or Sabiobi were the talk of the town, coming off of star-studded rosters, so seeing a talent this promising from a team that was horrible is a nice thing to watch. And at his side, Striker had his infamous DPS partner, Dream Casper. The DPS line of Boston Uprising was genuinely top tier, outperforming the best some days. Even after Dream Casper was outed for liking kids a bit more than you should, Mistakes came in alongside Striker, where he did a fantastic job filling the empty shoes. Boston Uprising had the first ever perfect stage, going 10-0 in stage 3, mainly due to vast mistakes in Striker, honestly. Boston, of course, lost the stage final to NYXL, but I don't think anyone had Boston as a top team before the season started, so it's an achievement if you look at it in that regard. 2018 finished out for them at 26-14, third overall seed. Most of their season losses came from stage 4, which was kind of disgusting. Going 4-6 after having a perfect stage and making finals is not a good showing in comparison. Unfortunately, this downward spiral continued for playoffs, where they got knocked out by Philadelphia Fusion, who had a run of their own, knocking NYXL out as well. After the season ended, Striker was surely a sought-after talent. Boston did have their ups and downs, but he was good through and through. I'd say easily the best player on this roster. From start to finish, he was clearly talented on Tracer and a solid hitscan player. Crusty thought so too, since after he transferred to Shock for 2019, Striker went along with him. And as a side note, this is the first from Boston to Shock transition for Striker. This season was of course looking amazing for Shock. After their disappointing 2018, they acquired the head coach for Boston Uprising, 9K and Striker were reunited, all the good players were of age, Violet was an upcoming talent. It was all good news, as I'm sure you're aware, and there's no reason to go into this for the 100 billionth time. Everyone who's watched competitive Overwatch play knows how 2019 Shock performed. But for Striker's case, he didn't really have much to do with it, since the meta was GOATs almost all year. Shock had Rascal playing Brig or Baptiste, and Sinatra played Zarya, so Striker rotted on the bench for most of the season, outside of a few select instances, which was kind of disappointing considering how good his previous season was. It was getting to the point where worries could start coming out if he were to play, asking questions like how much has he been scrimming, will his performances start to dip. Going long periods of time without playing surely could have a hindrance on some people, depending on who they are. We saw DPS played the most in Stage 4 because that's when Rollock was implemented, where I only saw Striker on a handful of maps. Shock stuck with having Architect in a lot, playing alongside Sinatra and Rascal, swapping them in and out depending on what comp they wanted to play. It was not until playoffs where we saw Striker enter the battlefield regularly. Thankfully, it was on Reaper, so if there were any suspicions a viewer would have about him being washed or wondering how he'd be looking, there was nothing to worry about because he's on Reaper, where he's put in an intangible value position, presumably being a very vocal shot caller, since mechanically it's like, whoa, the teleport was so sick. What are you really gonna say about Reaper? Regardless of that, I'm sure fans of him from 2018 were happy to finally see the Beast return. It's a similar situation with Smurf. Neither of them really played throughout 2020, and they both got stuck in during playoffs. And it's funny to me how they became one of the most iconic Winston Tracer duos of all time. Shock had their famous lower bracket playoff run in 2019, losing to Atlanta Reign 4-3, then 4-0ing every other team they went against, including Vancouver Titans, who were sadly very flaccid in the finals, quite disappointing considering how good their regular season was. Depending on who you ask, during this time period, Striker would still be seen as one of the best players in the world, like he just won grand finals, so how could he not be? But if you wanted to be an asshole, you could want more. All he did was play Reaper for a handful of matches. You could question how much did he actually contribute. As a viewer, you don't really know. It would be reasonable for someone to think Architect is more valuable to the team than Striker was coming off of this season. Considering how much more playtime Architect had, I can understand why people would want more from Striker, where he was going to be kept on the roster for the next season, whether people thought he was champion material or not. But Rollock was going to be here all year, so any leftover skeptics would hope this was the time to see it. Answering that question, is Striker truly one of the best players, and did he deserve that ring? Going into 2020 was weird. I feel a lot of people flipped on their head for who was actually the best DPS on Shock. Everyone was obviously really high on Sinatra. Again, people questioned how good Striker truly was at this point, since he spent a majority of 2019 cosplaying as a Vast. Rascal had some high peaks previously. Architect was also a player people had their eyes on, since he showed genuinely promising performances in 2019. Ons also came in as a rookie, so viewers had multiple players to keep their eyes on, wondering who would play what with a DPS line of 5 people. Apparently, Crusty had the same question. When the season started, Shock's DPS rotation was strange. Sinatra did retire shortly into the season, so he was out almost immediately, bringing us down to only 4 players. Then we saw Architect, Striker, and Ons all play Hitscan at different points. When Striker and Architect played it, the performances were just fine, but Ons seemed to be the clear-cut talent for Hitscan right off the rip. His first pop-off match against Gladiators was kinda crazy, so that left us what to do with Architect, Rascal, and Striker. Thankfully, or not thankfully, depending on how you look at it, Architect was shipped out to Hangzhou Spark partway into the season, just leaving 3 DPS players on the Shock roster. After this change was made, everything came together and was more fluid. It's almost like you don't need 5 DPS players on a roster. Ons moved into the Hitscan role in Permanence. For Stage 1, Rascal played a lot of Pharah, Mei, or whichever other flex DPS heroes were needed, and Striker was just there to play Tracer, essentially. Occasionally playing something else, but primarily Tracer. It could be nonsense to just have a player on a roster for one hero, but in this case, when the meta started leaning more towards Ashe Tracer, it played into Shock's hands perfectly. Ons looked like he was cheating, having one of the most absurd hitscan performances ever, and even though Striker didn't play much in 2019, he didn't play Tracer at all actually, somehow looked even better than he did in 2018. He would always just work some sort of magic with this hero, being leaps and bounds better than almost everyone else from a micro and macro standpoint. Barely any players could compete with Striker in North America on this hero. It was genuinely that big of a gap. Maybe if Kevster was not on ping, or if Prophet and Fleta were in North America, possibly there would have been more competition for him. Shax was one of the few people that could actually keep up with Striker, as well with Kai keeping up with Ons and Hitscan, which made for really interesting matchups when Valiant went against Shock. Teams holding a candle to this Shock DPS line was so few and far between. Even the likes of Philadelphia Fusion struggled. They had Carpe, who was good enough to compete with Ons, but no Tracer to match Striker. Shock's DPS line was undoubtedly the most well-rounded and best in North America. Then of course in other roles they had top tier players, making them a pretty overpowered team. When it comes to the accolades for this season, I was really hoping to find Striker's Tracer statistics. Sadly, I could not. If I had to guess, he would probably be number 1 in everything. And when it comes to the other accolades for this season, Shock won 2 out of 3 stages, both May Melee and Countdown Cup, and finally being the 3rd overall seed going into playoffs, which had a massive meta shift. We started moving in a direction where Striker would be playing other heroes, one of them being Reaper, shocking I know, and the other being Hanzo. This was another hero he did play in the regular season here and there, but this Roadhog vomit-inducing meta ended up having Hanzo and Widow as the DPS line mostly, and Striker Ons was a perfect DPS duo for this comp. Striker was immaculate with it and had the big PP aura on this hero. Something I realized after looking at Striker's career again, he wasn't the most flexible player. In the span of 3 years, he played about 3 heroes frequently, Reaper, Tracer, and Hanzo, but he was so elite at them, he was able to ascend into stardom. The Tracer performances were mind-blowing for the time in both 2018 and 2020. Reaper was Reaper, and his Hanzo was imperative to Shock winning yet another ring in 2020. On top of this, after they got their ring, Striker won Finals MVP. Not to get too far ahead, but it's kind of weird to me this is the only individual award Striker ever won in his career. Considering the standard he's held to by a lot of people, you'd think he'd be a bit more decorated than he is. But even with all of the hype in the air, that saying "it's calm before the storm" was slowly rearing its head, because one was undoubtedly coming. As I'm sure you're aware, the Shock Dynasty came to an end in 2021. They brought on new talent to go alongside the veterans. A minimal amount of skepticism was thrown towards this roster, which is quite shocking considering how both Glister and Nero were unproven talents. Everyone just trusted the crust and awaited the 2021 season to begin. And that trust was broken quite fast. The randomness of which player came in and out was jarring. Similar to the beginning of 2020, things were clearly not sorted out by the time the season started. This was the infamous year of Violet playing Hitscan, and to be fair, it didn't look bad, but Shock had 3 Hitscan players. Glister was stepping in the shoes of Ons, and Striker is technically a Hitscan player, even though he barely played it outside of 2018. Tayo was also a Hitscan player, so Violet playing it just didn't make much sense to a lot of viewers. Striker was the one who played it the most, where it looked fine. There were a few highlights, just nothing to truly write home about. It's not a position he ever looked comfortable in. Shock kinda struggled during the first stage, but people had faith in this team to pull everything together. But in the midst of all these thoughts, we got the news dropped into our laps. Completely out of left field, Striker just retired, where Shock would go on to finish the season without him. No one thought too deep about it. People gave their praise to him and his accomplishments for Shock, winning 2 rings, getting Finals MVP in 2020, and depending on who you ask, he's the best Tracer of all time. Needless to say, a career most wish they could scratch the surface of. It was a happy, but also very sad moment. No one ever thought they'd see him again. He'd just be stuck on a pedestal of the best to ever do it, with the others to join in coming seasons. That's until we did see him again. Not in 2021, but in 2022, returning to the Boston Uprising, this being his 2nd time on the franchise. A strange roster, I would say. 3 tanks in a solo game, Valentine, Victoria, and Striker as DPS, then Faith, Crimzo, and the all-powerful Racism Battle Pass unlock as support. Undoubtedly, a noticeable step down in comparison to his Shock teammates. Still, everyone hoped he would bring his veteran knowledge in and help the newer players out, while obviously showcasing his mechanical prowess that we've seen previously. Where Striker came right out the gates on Soldier, since the hero was overpowered during this time period, every team was playing it. He was splitting time with Victoria. Initially, you'd think Striker would be the player who never got benched, but instead Valentine got that treatment. Boston barely won their opening match against Vancouver Titans 3-2, then lost against Gladiators and London Spitfire, both ending 3-1, and we just never saw Striker after that. Where you'd think jokingly, he must have just rage quit, he's just a big baby, until we saw the sneak diss tweet from Huck, the quote president of gaming, saying no one player is greater than the team. You'd question what that meant until you saw Striker's release from Boston Uprising the following day, alluding towards some toxic behavior, which there were rumblings of during and before this time frame. If we fast forward years later for a second, Nero did give insight on some of the happenings within the 2021 Shock of Striker being very toxic to him, and even more rumors, not from Nero, just in general, of Striker's first run on Boston Uprising of him breaking keyboards and disrespecting his teammates. It was an unexpected pool of juice that was spilled into the world, where some of it does need to be taken with a grain of salt. Like everything about the 2018 Boston Uprising, nobody knows if he was truly whipping keyboards at the wall. But when it comes to the 2021 Shock stuff, that has been backed up by other people, so we kind of know that's what really happened there. His 2021 retirement wasn't even a retirement. Striker just got removed from the Shock roster from being problematic, and he probably just didn't know what else to do. So with this in mind, happening the season right before this one, and factoring in Huck's sneak diss at Striker, it's safe to assume that Striker was removed from this roster as well, presumably due to toxicity. But there's one person who doesn't care about toxicity, probably, and that's Crusty, especially when he needs help. 2022 Shock was a fantastic team, performing exceptionally well, until Stage 4. There were some issues with the DPS line. Kilo wasn't performing great. They must have not really known what to do with Sam, so Shock wanted more depth, where we'd see Striker come back to Shock for the second time, aiding in a slight turnaround for that stage. But due to there being no stage final, everyone was just looking towards playoffs. Also, the fact Shock was already qualified for it, this stage didn't really matter for them. It's hard to say Striker looked better here than he did on Boston because he barely played before. He played bits of Sombra and Tracer, undoubtedly being humbled the instant he went back to Shock. I can understand why Striker's going to think he's better than Victoria or Valentine back when he was on Boston Uprising, because they weren't the greatest players. Obviously, an ego comes with winning 2 rings, and players of a lower caliber will be looked down on. But with the performances that Proper was having in 2022, Striker's not the big dog anymore, and if he thought he would be, Striker would genuinely be a lost cause of a human. Proper carried this team so hard, it would actually be impossible for Striker to outshine him. As this stage was closing, it appeared they were gonna stick with the Striker Proper DPS line, which was a good thing because playoffs was right around the corner. And right when playoffs started, we entered the world of mirror metas. Winston, Sojourn, Reaper, Lucio, Kiriko, every map, every point, every team. When it came to the Shock, Striker took on the Reaper role, doing his helicopter cosplays, having his time in the sun while Proper did the heavy lifting. That's not to say Striker didn't have his moments. There were plenty of highlights. For whatever reason, when you stick him on Reaper, he can always pull something out of his ass. The only time he didn't, when he should have, was against the Houston Outlaws, where they lost 3-2, getting sent right down to the lower bracket. And it actually looked like we were going to see a repeat of 2019 again. After losing to Houston, Shock burned through the entire lower bracket to reach the final boss. Unfortunately, not being able to cut it out in the end, Fearless put Mikey in a submission hold. He just couldn't compete with Fearless. If Shock did win this finals, both Violet and Striker would have been 3-time champions, where, again, if Striker truly deserved to be considered a 3-timer, depends on who you ask. since he didn't contribute to the whole season success, whereas Violet did. But it doesn't matter anyways because Shock lost, and most of these players were dropped after the season was over. Shock wanted to go in the direction of building around Proper and Finn, getting the O2 Blast core, but the more important thing to be wondering here is what would happen to Striker. Is he really going to retire this time? It was being tossed around, maybe he would, maybe he wouldn't. We all waited in the offseason for the rosters to be announced for 2023, and then the big bombshell was dropped. Accruing 2.1 million views on Twitter, the 2023 Boston Uprising, Smurf, Lee Jae-gon, Izayaki, Birdring, Decay, and Striker, with Twilight and Kalios joining shortly after this announcement. People were over the moon to see this team play. There are only 2 players on this roster who did not win a ring, that being Decay and Kalios, which is ridiculous how a team like this could be formed during a season with 0 money. Like, how does this even happen? Not just the roster coming together, but Striker joining Boston for the 3rd time. He joined Boston in 2018, goes to Shock for 2019, rages and then gets kicked in 2021, goes back to Boston in 2022, gets kicked again, then joins Shock to finish 2022, gets dropped afterwards, and then finally joins Boston one more time in 2023. It actually makes me want to throw up how many times he went back and forth. Regardless, as the season opened, we could immediately tell Boston was going to be a great team. There were rumors of them imploding, which seemed to be over-exaggerated. All of these players in match had great synergy and individual talent, where fitting Striker in seemed impossible. There are a lot of Decay haters in the world, mainly due to his 2020 behavioral problems on Dallas Fuel, but that doesn't take away how talented of a player he is. Decay was an exceptional tracer. Putting him on a champion level team to play the hero made complete sense. He overshadowed Striker at this point. If Boston put Striker on Tracer over Decay in 2023, they were making a mistake. Striker isn't going to play Hitscan, Hanzo, or Sombra over Birdring, since he was unexpectedly incredible during 2023, actually one of the best Sombras in the league, leaving Striker to just rot. Like, what is he gonna play, Reaper? Birdring Decay covered everything. I think Striker played one match until he was dropped shortly into the season. Some could have been upset, but again, he wasn't really needed. But thankfully for him, there's always one person that can use him on the roster. Crusty was having his own struggles, somehow fumbling a roster like 2023 Shock. They needed to have a rebuild partway through the season, quickly ending one of the most hyped rosters in Overwatch League history. There were memes being tossed everywhere that Striker would be coming back to Shock, since it's an actual joke at this point. I think it's great that Shock even played into it with his announcement for him joining the franchise for his 3rd time. This one human being has gone back and forth with the same 2 franchises more than anyone else ever has. A part of me wonders if this was a genuine signing, or Crusty just wanted to reunite with his son but not really for marketing. I don't think many were even high on Striker anymore. There are plenty of players who just surpassed him in skill at this point. But to be fair to Striker, Shock did look slightly better with their retooled roster, just not enough to make playoffs, being the only season outside of 2018 where they didn't make it. Ending how they started, dog shit. Also, Crusty and Striker riding and dying together. Striker is a person who had a career that is just weird. In the beginning, he was a genuine talent that joined Boston, exceeded all expectations, went to Shock, came in at the final hour to win a ring, goes into 2020, shows that he was arguably the best tracer in the world once again, wins finals MVP and another ring, then has a back end that's just a blur, going from team to team, barely staying for a few months because he's either toxic or there in the final hour because Crusty felt like giving him a job. Typically, a player would just fall off and retire or ride their career out until they can't stand it anymore. But Striker was a much different human than all of us, I guess. He'll still go down in the history books no matter what though. His Tracer and Hanzo, even Reaper performances during their respective time periods were like none other. I highly doubt we'll ever see Striker again in Champion Series, unless he decided to take on a coach role. That is, unless Crusty ever needed another player on Team Falcons. Possibly then we would see the Beast return. So with all of this said, what are your opinions on Striker? Do you think he is the best Tracer to ever do it, or a stinky poo-poo head for being toxic to his teammates? As always, make sure to leave all of your thoughts in the comments below.
Heck, man, this is
They got the A wall here and boosted him up onto the doorway. Okay.
No one expects
What is the
this.
plan here? Is it's going to be a flash.
Oh my god! Striker's cheeky. God, his spidey senses were tingling. He just drops down and apprehends these ne'er-do-wells.